Right, found it. There we go. Sorry, it disappeared into my bit. Okay, so well, thank you very much for joining us. Like we were just talking with Hannah, this is session 4 of 5. So we've looked at vocabulary, we've looked at reading fluency, reading comprehension. This one, we're going to try and look through some of the evidence around writing. And essentially, that's looking at recommendations 4 and 5 in the guidance report, which is here. If you haven't got one of these, you can download it. But if you'd like physical copies of the guidance report, Improving Literacy in Secondary Schools, please let me know. We can send a bunch over to you. If it might be useful to share around colleagues or whatever, we'll send you a bunch over. So we'll be looking essentially through recommendations 4 and 5 today. Somebody's just joining us. So as soon as I think it's Matt just gets here, we'll share the screen. Okay, so let's crack on. There we go. So hopefully everybody can see that. Does that look all right? Just give us a thumbs up if you can see that all right. Perfect. All right. So secondary literacy, like I say, writing. Everybody knows who I am by now. So they're the recommendations. So this is what we're going to try and do. Just to think about the complexity of writing. As with reading, I think it's really important to perhaps help support staff by having a shared language around. We've looked at that around the reading with the tier model and so on, the tiered vocabulary with reading fluency, some of the models around reading. So we're going to try and do the same for writing and sort of unpack the components of writing, because that, as we know, it's quite complex. So we're going to try and break it down into some of those executive functions, planning, monitoring, and so on. We're going to talk about modeling each step and using the 7-step model to do that. We've got a couple of examples to go through. And other things like that. So we'll crack on. So have a look here. So here's the first one. So the recommendation 4 is all about breaking down complex writing tasks. So writing, we know, is challenging, and students in every subject will benefit from explicit instruction in how to improve their writing in each subject. Teachers can therefore break down writing into planning, monitoring, and evaluation, supporting students by modeling each step. Targeted support should be provided to students who struggle to write fluently, because that might affect their writing quality, and we'll look at ways we can do that. And use a variety of approaches, including collaborative and paired writing, to hopefully motivate students in their writing. We'll look at some of those ways. So does anybody, here's a question, anybody know what that is? Anybody have a guess what that might be? Any idea at all?
Can't really see it very well.
No, yeah, it's not clear, is it? It is the overall plan from J.K. Rowling of the Harry Potter novels, apparently.
Oh.
There you go. What about this one? You might get this one because you could probably see some of the... Anyone know what this one is? If you look right at the bottom, there's a phrase that you might...
1984?
It is, you're absolutely right. Yeah, so it's a draft from George Orwell of his novel 1984. The point of all this, I guess, is that, you know, writing, as we'll see, involves redrafting, evaluating, monitoring, going over it again and again. And so there's a couple of quotes here. This one I really like because I find this bit, particularly in science writing, is very hard to get the kids to do, to edit, to go back and redraft, but actually really important in order to achieve really high quality written responses. Here's Hemingway. And this one is probably sums it up, I guess, certainly in terms of what a lot of my students say. So if writing seems hard, it's because it is hard. It's one of the hardest things people can do. So writing's hard. Here are some of the things that we have to consider when we're considering writing. So we've got spelling, grammar, punctuation, imagery, audience, word inferences, accuracy, paragraphs, planning, genre, word choices, handwriting, purpose. Oh my goodness. Lots of things to have a little think about. So there's 2 models coming up now. This first one shows some of the strands that previous slide there sort of point towards. So we've got the kind of critical thinking, executive function kind of things at the top there, generating ideas, gathering information, marshalling that information into what's going to be necessary, what's going to answer the question. Then the process of organizing, planning, drafting, monitoring, evaluating, revising. Then on top of that, you've got to think about grammar and syntactic awareness, sentence elaboration, punctuation, that whole SPAG area, which we'll get to later on. Then, of course, text structure, which is very disciplinary. So the text structure of things that you might read and write in English are going to be completely different to the text structures that you might see and have to be expected to write about in science or geography or history or whatever. Writing craft, where word choice, again, is really probably a disciplinary thing. So in writing English responses, that's probably going to be the choice of words is going to be more complex probably than science, where science is a level of tier 3 vocabulary that we've got to know, whereas English language, when you're doing a written response, you've got to choose words that are good adjectives and so on and so forth. And then finally, transcription, which is all about them getting their ideas from their head onto the page, their handwriting, their spelling, their typing, whatever it is to do with that. So that's one model. Here is the EF model. So this is what they call a simple view of writing. I think to link it into the simple view of reading, if you remember back to when we were looking at reading fluency and comprehension. So here they're broken down, those things we've just seen on that sort of rope, into composition, transcription, and executive function, all of which have impacts on working memory. So the ideas about cognitive science, what we know about cognitive load, working memory, that extraneous load we want to minimize, and the intrinsic load from the particular task that they're doing, making sure that that's as germane as possible, and supporting students where necessary to get each of these different areas as fluent as they can to produce the highest quality writing that they can. So that's the simple view of writing. Obviously, the writing cycle, you could do it as a process. So this probably won't be unfamiliar to people, but you might have to plan it to start with, draft it, share it with teachers, peers, small groups, evaluate it, revise it, edit it before, it says publishing, but before producing your final draft. So that, again, these ways are just kind of hopefully getting some shared language around what we actually have to do when we think about writing. So here's the writing cycle with a little bit more detail on it, and also the outer edge, thinking about the purpose of the written response, the audience that they're writing for. So I'll give you a second just to have a quick read through that. So hopefully you got that. So some of the things we perhaps need to consider then are certainly the fact that it's a very complex skill to be asked to produce high quality written responses in any subject. There's going to be lots of difficult things that they're going to be asked to do all at once, no matter which model you're using there. There's lots of things for students to consider. Lots of discrete skills as well. So we know there's a process involved. We know we've got to get to that text cohesion work. And so a large part of the evidence says that teaching explicitly, modeling each step, getting students to be as fluent as they can be in each of the discrete skills is only going to be beneficial for their responses of high quality written responses in the future. So I'll give you a second to read that. I won't read it all out, but writing is hard. So I think the idea behind what the evidence says is that by breaking each step down of the process, by thinking about each of the separate skills, by allowing students to practice, starting off with guided practice, might be, sentence starters, sentence stems, all that sort of stuff, gradually withdrawing that scaffolding and withdrawing that help, that structured support, as they gain more independence through their independent practice. That's the way to go about it. So if we're going back from these sort of sessions to help other colleagues, that's hopefully where you see the idea of the shared language, a shared understanding about how writing happens, the complexity, the components of it. Oops, sorry. That's where hopefully it will come in as a shared language much more usefully. So we'll have a think in a second about some of the different strategies. So that comes, I think, from Graham and people like that, teaching school students to be effective writers. But the question is, in your lessons, in fact, perhaps we'll just pause for a quick bit of response here. How many of those individual steps in your lessons, if you're happy to say, or in your school, if you did drop-ins and stuff, how many of those individual steps, how many of the different discrete skills do you see modeled by teachers? So let's just have a pause, and if it's okay, a bit of feedback.
I think it's really hard because with the demands of the time that you've got, particularly at GCSE, I find it really hard to model things like the drafting process, which we all know is so important, and is no writer sits down in an exam, do they, in a sports hall and writes their best piece of work in 45 minutes. It's a constant process of drafting and redrafting, but I find having to get them to that point where they can write a really, really brilliant piece of writing in 45 minutes in exam conditions without that process of editing and drafting and redrafting, I find that really hard. And I think it's a real challenge.
Do you think there's any benefit though in doing that in lessons, and even though there's a time limit and therefore a process limit on what they might produce in an exam, surely there's benefit to having gone through all that beforehand, teaching them the stages? Would you say?
Of course, absolutely, of course.
Yeah, and are we talking about English exams, or what?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'm coming at it from an English language point of view, I guess. Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. I think for other subjects, like I'm a science teacher, and the longest question that they're going to have to answer in science exams will be a 6-marker. In the old days, a few years ago, that would be judged as well in terms of there'd be marks for the quality of that written communication. That's gone out of the exams now, but they're still expected, to fill, sometimes even a whole page of blank space in order to write the response. So there's still skills within that we need to teach them. For me, I think it's about getting them to be as fluent as possible in each of the skills that the individual subjects require when they come to exams. If you see what I mean. Does that make sense? All right, anybody else? Paula, what about you?
Sorry, go on. Oh, sorry. I would just reiterate both of what you both said, actually. I'm English, but also have been in charge of other subjects. And so outside of English, I think a lot of people would say that the time constraints, but also really having banged on about knowledge-led and less skills, and the amount that say, yes, you can just bullet point your answers, you don't have to do that, and actually they don't need that. And so it has been a bit of a little bit battle. Most people are pretty good, to be honest, at the almost like the planning side and sentence structures of that first written piece, but then expecting that to be it. Not the revising, not the editing. To be honest, since I think since perhaps COVID as well, definitely less of the evaluating and the peer evaluation. I got some year 7s to do that, just see what can you do in English the other day. And honestly, the things they were just writing, they was just like, you slay, awesome. And it was just like, they had no concept of what they should. I mean, I did just leave it open to see what they would do. They had no concept of what they should be praising about or anything like that. So I think the initial part, but I think the expectation that you write it first, you write it brilliant, that seems to be a bit across the board.
Can I jump in on what you were just saying? Because we've just really properly this year really gone for formative assessment and then summative assessment. And we've spent a lot of time like really helping students on their formative assessment, and then dedicating curriculum time like 2 lessons after to actually seeing how the success criteria is like seen in their work and how it's not. And then you're absolutely right, like before we had like, you know, you have to stick to the success criteria, they were just writing, oh, you know, your handwriting's really good, and you think, well, that's fab, but that's not actually going to help you make an improvement. And what we're finding with a lot of our year 7s, they're coming to us having had like an exciting writing book at primary school, and so they're quite well trained in rewriting and like adding on. Also they're quite heavily reliant on the teachers showing them what to write, and then them just copying, and then them changing 1 or 2 parts, which is something that we're trying to obviously like, you know, take away from them a little bit. But certainly absolutely dedicating curriculum time to that evaluating and redrafting, and never ever marking as a teacher the first effort. It's always got to go through like, you know, stage 2 and stage 3, and then you take it home and mark it after that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I'm just trying to reflect here in terms, like I said, I'm a science teacher, and you can very much see that whole process being definitely taught within the curriculum of something like English, but, you know, because that you need to get that fluency. But I for sure have had arguments in school, as in, you know, talked arguments, not arguments, about the fact, you know, how much curriculum time do we need to devote to things like this and reading, when actually there's so much science GCSE material content to get through. But actually, you know, it's when if you show students what they've written the first time, and then even just the very first part of redrafting would obviously be for them to read through their initial answer, the amount of nonsense that kind of, you know, because they're kind of stream of consciousness type thing, the need for at least another read through and then a redraft, even on, you know, small 4 mark, 5 mark, 6 mark answers in science, is totally there. It might not be as in depth, and we might not spend as much curriculum time as English do, for example, but absolutely there. Anyway, Matt, you were going to say something.
Just to add on, really, just to kind of mirroring what some people said already, but there's been 2 observations that I've made kind of across several schools, which are all kind of showing the same kind of thing, really. That number one, it's a bit like you were saying earlier with the how much time is dedicated to it, and actually have they got time, for example, in English, in a 45 minute answer, you know, have they got, they need to, you know, get the answer down, and particularly for extended writing, and to get that done. But then, you know, kind of a way into that, one thing that I think the attitude that we need to change is, well, actually, you know, are we, particularly at Key Stage 3, are we just teaching to an exam, or are we wanting to have that sky's the limit? You know, actually, some of you are going to be authors, some of you are going to be, you know, journalists, some of you are going to be, and it's about that general, and, you know, and not just teaching to the exam kind of thing. I think that's something that within some of our schools, that's where one of the things that we need to kind of change a little bit. But secondly, I think it's also, when it does come to exams, it's become common practice, I think, that it's kind of a, right, you've got 20 minutes to write this, write it now, and then we stop, and then it's like, right, then swap books, peer assess, and that's when the reviewing, revising, and redrafting editing takes place, where I think we need to start embedding it into that 20 minutes. You know, so it's like within 20 minutes you need to have written it, and you're going to have done a self-assessment, a peer assessment, where you're then going to redraft, even if it's, you know, just starting one. And that's challenging. I think that's the biggest thing that we find. It does come back to that curriculum time, and that when so yeah, it is
and I mean, in terms of time, there's never any easy answers, is there? That, you know, I could literally give you a million guidance reports about loads of brilliant evidential approaches, evidence-informed approaches, but we're never going to have all the time to do all of those every single lesson, you know. So it is about thinking very clearly what is the best for our students, what do they particularly need. Obviously, the EF and the Research School Network are obviously really interested in supporting disadvantaged students and helping them achieve better, not only educationally, but I think Matt's absolutely right. There's, on the one hand, as schools, there are measures to which we're held accountable for, exams and so on and so forth. So we got to prepare students for exams and their qualifications. But school's not just about that. Certainly not for me. Like Matt said, it's about preparing them for life, and them being able to write is a massive skill that is a part of lots and lots of jobs, isn't it? I'm just also thinking in terms of exam preparation, if we honed in on that, some of these discrete skills might be even more important when we prepare students just for exam writing. I'm particularly thinking about the planning phase, you know, the stuff that the executive function that goes through children's minds in order that if they've only got 40 minutes to answer a 16-mark question in history or something like that, that planning then becomes really important, that they plan it out in order to get that first draft as good as possible, simply because they won't have time to extensively redraft and edit and so on. Does that make sense? Right, anybody else? Oh, I'll keep pressing the wrong button here. Sorry. Sam, anything to add? You don't have to at all, but feel free to jump in if necessary.
Well, the only thing I would add on top of what everybody else has talked about, I don't have direct experience of teaching in English, but I do use the English sort of methodology, I suppose. So please don't shoot me down if I'm getting it wrong. But if you're preparing a long answer in a maths exam, then I do expect them to plan. And I expect them to map out what they're going to do, and I expect them to go back and check that they've answered the question they've been asked. So it's a similar kind of process. But obviously the writing is not done with a lot of words, it's done with a lot of workings instead.
Yeah, absolutely. But the executive functions are still there, aren't they? The planning, the mapping it out, the metacognition of evaluating, you know, checking back the answers. That's a strategy for sure that is explicitly taught by you and necessary for students to have success there. Brilliant. Well, thank you. Well, let's crack on with the next couple of slides. Here's some examples. This slide in a notes to this slide, I haven't got them now, but I was reading them earlier on. It makes the point that a lot of us were making in terms of time. You know, this class was spending a lot of time on some of the components of it. They were saying it's about finding the balance between spending time and seeming to go slow in terms of getting fluency and getting accuracy and automaticity in some of those different components. But actually, in the long run, if you plan that well, is going to help those kids to produce better quality, higher quality written responses at the end there. So, yeah, it's difficult, particularly in terms of things. So, as we know, common theme running through effective forms of instruction is that we're breaking it down and asking or helping students to become as fluent in these processes as quickly as they can, as best they can. So that might involve planning. So we talked about this. On the left there, you might recognize that, particularly if you're a history teacher, quite often using history. It's called a fishbone diagram. So it's a way of you graphically organizing knowledge beforehand and then using that as a plan towards what you're going to write down. On the right hand side there, you might recognize the 7-step model. So, you know, that model, which comes from the metacognition and self-regulation guidance report, it fits really, really nicely into this. So in terms of a structured lesson around it, you might activate prior knowledge. That might be recapping on the main ideas that they need to write about. It might be thinking about specific vocabulary that they need to use or you're expecting them to use. Then it might be discussing the particular component of writing that you're looking at. So in this case, it's the planning. So one of the strategies in this case is that fishbone is going to use a graphic organizer to explicitly teach that strategy. The kids then obviously, before the kids do it, the teacher models that really clearly. The kids memorize that, they know about it. And then there's a series of guided practice events where perhaps you draw one up on the board together, and then independent practice where they do it a bit more independently, gradually withdrawing that so that in the end you can have structured reflection on how that's gone. So that's the metacognition 7-step model that can be brought into some of the explicit teaching, modeling, and supportive strategies when we talk about the components of writing. So here's another example. What is an expanded noun phrase might be talking to the kids about a particular thing that they're going to do. Talking about personification and then going through like that. So obviously that's an example from English. And then, of course, the idea that we've talked about already is that, we don't want to overload students with too much burden on their working memory. That, cognitive load theory, lots of teachers know about that, obviously. But there's so much going on there that without some scaffolding, without support, actually, even the most capable students can quickly get overwhelmed with the burden of complexity around writing. So the message, the clear message, I've said this before, but it's really clear in the guidance report. The message from the evidence is that to support students to get better long-term at extended writing, we've got to break each bit down, focus on each bit, even if it's that planning for a few lessons, doing lots of different plans again and again and again. And then, the next component, even down to transcription and handwriting and spelling, we'll get to that in a second. So that's just linking the metacognitive model on the left there with the cycle. So what could the structure of the plot be? Does this bit of action fit in here? And so on and so forth. Various questions. Various questions. So this, this whole writing cycle is actually a very metacognitive process. So if you haven't read the metacognition guidance report, then definitely worth having a little read, see how that works, because a lot of the explicit teaching could fit very much nicely into that diagram on the left, and of course the 7-step model, which is one way of doing it. So we at this school, Mounts Bay Academy, we just sort of started asking teachers to kind of do this kind of lesson structure or episode of lesson structure. I do, we do, you do. Again, very metacognitive. So a teacher modeling, particularly thinking aloud, students observing that. So if we're answering a written question, let's say, I was doing this the other day, I'll give you an example from my Year 11 lesson. We were looking at, the question was, I'm just trying to remember now. It was, how does burning coal, essentially was, how does burning coal lead to erosion of limestone statues? So I was talking through the fact there was 4 marks in the mark scheme for that. So they had to make sort of logical stepping stone little leaps from the starting point to the end point, and write clear sentence for each, obviously using connectives like this leads to, so that this happens, and whatever. Of course, the answer is when you burn coal's got sulfur in it. Sulfur, when it's burned, turns to sulfur dioxide because you oxidize it. Sulfur dioxide reacts with water in the atmosphere to make sulfuric acid, which forms acid rain. Acid rain forms on things like statues, which are made out of limestone, and it obviously reacts with that. So modeling that aloud, maybe giving some support, visual support as well. Getting them to tackle similar problems, so similar sort of questions. So on that one, we had another question where they had to try and come up with the stepping stones, those little logical bullet points between a start point and an end point, which is a very common sort of question in science. So sometimes science, the longer questions, they have a start point and an end point, and to get the marks, it's literally you have to step stone your way logically from that point to this point. And then, of course, you do, where they're more independent, and so on and so forth. Sam, you might know about this, but there's some there's an idea called variation theory, which I know a lot of mathematicians use.
Yeah.
Which is all about judging so having a bunch of questions, and it works quite well in maths because you can have lots of examples of questions. A variation theory asks teachers to consider the way in which the questions vary. Not so at the start you might model really simple. I'm trying to think of a maths one now, Sam. You have to help me. But let's say we were doing, I don't know, percentage change questions. We do that in science as well. So you do one on the board. Then the next one, it's pretty much the same, but maybe you change one of the numbers so the kids get the idea. The next one, you just, so you're changing it very slightly, but actually then you're getting harder and harder. You're doing it the opposite way around, or even I think some variation theory says, that you've got some deliberate mistakes in there. So the kids want, when they've got that fluency of how to answer it, know that you've done something wrong. So
yeah, in the modelling phase, you would keep the questions the same, but with just change the numbers if you can. Something, that concept.
Yeah.
And then the variation theory sort of sits with the deliberate practice, where you are making a slight change on each question so that the pupils can think hard about what's different about this question. It avoids the kind of, well, I always do this and I always do that kind of process.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think, try to put that in the context of writing, it might be that we do that over a series of lessons around one particular component, whether that's planning, whether that's revising, whether that's, editing, whatever. So too much trying to, so again, this is making the point about the balance between doing it and actually getting on with writing, how much curriculum time we spend on these things. So some of these things, hopefully you can see that we definitely need to scaffold. We talked a little bit about planning. We're going to move on to spelling in a second. This, I think, is one of the things that students, some of my students certainly struggle with. It's about that thinking clearly in terms of what they write, because they've got to obviously transcribe it, but they've also got to know a lot of that background information. A science answer often requires a lot of information that they have to have activated in order for them to even write it. Then on top of that, they've got to choose the correct scientific vocabulary to kind of hit those keywords and phrases that might appear in the mark scheme. So there's a lot going on for students in there. Right, so the Hathershaw College, this is some slides from them. Don't go into much detail, but so they have writing models where they got different things for planning, drafting, revising, modeling that explicitly by the teachers. Then in terms of planning, and I think the evaluation as well, they use waggles and wabbles. So again, specific techniques, shared language with the students, shared language across different disciplines, which is often really helpful. We don't use waggle here. I know a lot of schools do. We used to use, my mind's totally gone blank. I know some schools use 3 stars and a wish, stuff like that. But that sometimes really helpful to kids having that consistent language, so they know that, particularly if they're writing in science and they're writing in history and they're writing in English, if they're using the same kind of language to do different components, it's going to be slightly easier for them. So anyway, here that pupils use waggles and wabbles, looking for techniques, relevant subject terminology, how the answer is addressing the question. Sam, you mentioned that earlier. Often really important in science as well, the amount of times you read a written answer and it's either, this is one thing I get annoyed, that annoys me in science. They read the question, but the only thing they write is actually information that was in the question. Do you know what I mean? I'm sure you get that sometimes as well, Sam. So it's just about, getting them to do that, and then activating prior knowledge of how they know what good one looks like, and so on and so forth. They use at this particular school mind maps, word banks, knowledge organizers. Like I said before, different graphic organizers are slightly better for different kinds of writing. So for the fishbone diagram, for example, is often used in the context of history because it has the cause and effect and things like that. It might be really good. In science, mind maps are great in terms of sort of dumping a load of information on, but they're perhaps not very good because of the dispersion of information for kind of planning. So that's what they use. Might be worth thinking about in terms of your subjects at your school, which kind of graphic organizers might be better used for planning. They use the ID We Do You Do, providing lots of writing frames, lots of sentence starters. We'll talk about some more of those a little bit later on. So that's at the drafting stage. And then when they come to revise and edit, making changes to the content of writing in the light of feedback and self-evaluation. So they've got a structure which all of the students use because all of the staff are using it in different contexts. And again, for me, that the benefit of that is that it reduces slightly the cognitive load for students because they recognize the language, they recognize the task, even though it might be a different subject. Because of the shared language, it's kind of the same. Right, we're just going to have a little pause for a second. Hopefully you haven't seen this video. I'm going to play this little video. What I want you to think about is Well, it'll be fairly obvious. Let's just see if it works. Hopefully you can hear it.
You're not making any sense. Johnny ruined it on purpose. He knows how to make one.
Step 1, get 2 pieces of bread out. Got 'em. Get a butter knife and get some PB. Take 1 piece of bread, spread it around with the butter knife.
No, Dad, with the peanut butter.
I'm just doing what it says. It says take 1 piece of bread, spread it around with the butter knife.
Hold on.
Get some jelly, rub it on the other half of the bread.
No, Dad, open the jelly.
Well, it doesn't say to do that. Put the breads together on top of each other. Take a big bite. This doesn't taste like a peanut butter and jelly salad. Oh.
Yeah, oh, yeah. Sorry, I had to make it extremely specific.
Oh, good. I'm starving. Take 2 pieces of white bread out of the bag. Take the lid off the jar of peanut butter. Get a butter knife and stick it inside of the peanut butter jar. With the knife, scoop a bit of peanut butter out of the...
That means like a lot.
A bit means a lot?
In my world.
Spread your scoop of peanut butter onto 1 of your pieces of bread with a knife. All right. There we go.
You're doing better than before, though.
Open the jelly jar. Squeeze it onto the other piece of bread.
No.
Done.
All right.
Okay.
Okay. I think hopefully you get the idea of that. So what sort of takeaways do you think we can glean from that? I've actually used this in my lesson, not the whole thing, but just a little clip. So why do you think I showed you that, and what possible takeaways could we get from that? Anybody? Why might I? What do you think, Hannah?
Yeah, I mean, it's about specific instructions, isn't it, and how we might best teach a process through the instruction that we give, and the process of that, and also by how our language, I guess, can be. We need to be mindful of the language that we use, and what to us may seem quite easy and straightforward to a student isn't. And I find myself doing this in lessons sometimes, saying things and thinking, well, and then having to almost take a step back and think, oh, they don't know my implied meaning. They don't know that. So I've got to take a step back and be way more specific and break it down way more. Yeah.
And I would say particularly for, students with particular needs, it's really important for us to consider all of our students, but there's going to be some students for sure that are going to need extra clear instructions. I'll tell you what I do with that. If I'm giving instructions, I give lots of instructions, let's say for a science practical, all at once, without, and then expect students to remember what to do, and obviously I've got a diagram and I break it down and all that, but very easy to do, isn't it, to overload kids or not to think about overloading kids.
Absolutely.
Specific.
Also, I'm just thinking about vocabulary. So there's a lot of vocabulary that could have been, needed to be reminded perhaps before we do certain writing tasks, sort of preloading that vocabulary and making that a really clear part of the success criteria. It's particularly for our maybe less able children. So, we want them to be able to show that they can get it, and by giving them the words that they need to use, a bit like sentence structures, I suppose, or sentence starters. Similar way, just they've got a checklist of the words they need to make sure they've got in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, get them up on the board and say, look, I expect these words in your answer. Yeah, and you've also taught them or reminded what does that word mean again, and so on and so forth. Absolutely. Right, here's what I've kind of hang on, I've got to go back to the slides. There we go. There we go. So obviously planning is really important for us to, I think, consider, for the students to consider planning, but actually what I was writing here was about for when we're modeling, to really carefully think about exactly what we're doing when we model, particularly, so one of the things that I'm really worried about, even for myself, is do I really understand the best way to write a science answer? Do all teachers really understand the complexity and the conventions of high quality written answers for their subject, whatever their subject is. You know, and if not, you know, it's really important for us to get together as colleagues to talk about that. So if we're asking colleagues to model planning, to model, you know, joining sentences together, or, you know, whatever aspect of it we're doing, you know, can we get together to plan that, to work out exactly how that's gonna be good? Here's another one. This actually comes from the effective PD one, the importance of rehearsal. So giving space for colleagues in professional development to actually practice, rehearse, role play specific episodes of lessons is actually really effective in terms of practice change when we're doing professional development. So for those of you that are thinking about putting, you know, some of this or anything in place in terms of professional development, and you want to see practice change, actually giving teachers the space to plan it properly, but then to role play that modeling is really, really useful. I think when I show this to kids, you know, they're always really surprised at how literal sometimes the dad was being, because you know, but it really makes the point that actually you've got to be, for specific tasks, you've got to be really, really specific. So even that little video clip I use it often to kind of just switch them on to. I use this when we're talking about writing methods and protocols for instruction, for science practicals, for example. So again, 6-mark questions in science, they're the longest answer we get, but you can get what's called assessed practical questions. So they could have a question, it might say, describe and explain how you would investigate blah blah blah, and it will give you the sort of title of an experiment to do. They've learned about it, but they have to be able to write out those instructions. And obviously they perhaps don't have to go to the extreme of that dad, but it's really clear when they're writing instructions. Sorry, they have to be very clear when they're writing instructions, talking about volume and apparatus, equipment, and so on and so forth. And I think, you know, like I said before, developing that common approach across department or school can be really, really useful. So different types of writing we ask people to do. Really important. This one is about making sure that teachers explicitly teach what their command words for exams or questions are for them. So, for example, in English, and you can shoot me down if I'm totally wrong about this, but if there was a question in English literature exam that said evaluate, that what the kids are expected to do for that might be slightly different than if you saw that in a PE exam or a science exam where it said evaluate these fuels and it had some data in a table. So obviously the word still means the same, but actually there's nuance to that kind of tier 2 command word that is going to be slightly different subject to subject. Obviously get teachers to consider what the master writing form is in their classroom. Like I said, the sort of gold standard for GCSE is the 6-marker for science, you know, essays for history and so on. But like Matt said before, am I doing my kids a disservice if I only ever stick to that kind of minimal approach? Because you know, is that a good preparation for A-level biology or degree level biology, where they're going to have to write much more? So actually thinking about the writing forms that are going to appear more in the disciplines could be really useful. Even in maths, Sam, I'm imagining you have to, at some point in maths education, you have to, you know, be able to write a bit to explain proofs beyond the kind of mathematical symbols and so on.
Yeah, definitely. And the word evaluate in maths means working out the value of.
Yeah.
So
well,
if you're asked to evaluate 2 cubed, you have to write down that it's 8, and you have to know that that's what you're supposed to do.
So that's good. Go on, I'll keep interrupting.
Yeah, they have. I mean, I was just thinking about writing a note there about what one of the threads that goes through maths in terms of literacy is the fact that we start by building certain things like angle facts. So they have angle facts in Key Stage 3, but that they have to state the fact that they're using every time they calculate something, and that builds all the way through to running formal proofs, where you have to be really specific about exactly which piece of a diagram you're talking about, using letter notation to identify the exact bit of the diagram and the fact that you've got with it. You have to use specific words. in order to make that work, and that builds them towards sort of future study where they have to, where most of it is writing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that comes from your knowledge of the conventions of mathematics writing, mathematical writing. But clearly, even just in you talking there, I'm thinking, you know, I don't know any of that. So obviously the kids are not going to know a lot of that. Are you therefore, your maths colleagues are responsible for explicitly teaching and training and supporting students in that? Anyway, fantastic example. Thank you.
Well, I was going to say one more thing. My son just started a maths degree, and he chose to do that because he thought he's good at doing sums and doing maths. And he did well in his A level, and he's not needed a calculator, and he's had to write pages and pages of words.
Oh man!
I'm thinking, I don't think we set them up that well for that kind of thing.
And like Matt said before, you know, it's, for me, education is, you know, obviously we got to do them a good service in terms of helping them get the best outcomes they can in terms of exams and qualifications, but it's also about preparing them for further education and for further life.
Exactly.
You know, so there's, I think, well, I'll go so far as to say I think there's a moral imperative for us to develop, you know, all of the skills, but particularly, you know, literacy skills. Obviously, that's the drum I'm banging on about in these things, and writing's a massive part of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much, Sam. Yes, we'll be screen again. Well, I can't remember what I was saying now, so let's just scooch onto the thing. So again, this is just sort of showing lots of different things that are going to be feeding into that. Each one might be specifically supported. In fact, let's just have another quick pause, actually, because we're not going to talk about, we're going to talk about spelling in a little while. I'm not sure we've got a whole bunch of stuff on this in terms of, there's a little bit of evidence I can tell you about, but handwriting. So the evidence is that essentially handwriting, the more fluent people's handwriting, the better other aspects of their syntax and spelling and grammar are going to be. So it seems to be saying that, you know, handwriting, while not necessarily having to be, you know, perfect, is actually an important thing for students to practice and become more automatic and fluent in. But this is a very personal opinion now, not backed up by any evidence. I often wonder how, outside of school, how important handwriting is in the future world. Do you know what I mean? So this is a non-evidence-based opinion that I'm saying now, because I don't really write anything anymore with my hands. I, you know, obviously type it all. So this is what I'm saying is handwriting. This is different to transcription, because transcription could include typing and stuff. You know, that's the idea. So that's really important. I'm not saying that. So what does anybody think about handwriting practice? Yeah. This might be a dead end, but Hannah, you look like you got something to say about.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting. I've got a daughter in primary school at the moment, and there's a big focus on handwriting, letter formation. There seems to be a big debate at the minute about whether they teach cursive writing or not. And I just thought it was interesting what you were saying about how relevant is it. And I don't know, as an English teacher mum, I'm obviously it's really important. But yeah, you're right. Like in the jobs that we're preparing students for, how many of them are going to be handwriting? I don't know. You know, it's interesting, isn't it? It's tomorrow's world, but certainly from an exam point of view, I always think it's interesting because obviously most of the students that we teach are still handwriting their exams, and most of them say to me, like, what is the point in this? Why are we handwriting exams? We're using, you know, touch screens for everything else, and yet we go into a sports hall and write everything with a pen. It's a really, I just think it's a really interesting debate, isn't it? And I don't know if there's an answer to it, but it's a really interesting.
I mean, for sure, there's a definite need in terms of exam preparation, like you say, whilst exams still are written. You know, there's absolutely, students need to be, you know, I might mock exams for science, obviously, here, and sometimes you literally can't make out what the kids have put. And obviously, if I was a real examiner, they wouldn't be getting any marks for that. So, you know, at one level, it's writing is about communication, and somebody else has to be able to read what you are trying to communicate through your handwriting. So that's definitely important. I think you know, again, I'm just trying to remember what the evidence says about like handwriting, but there is a link to better handwriting and practice handwriting, getting improving your spelling and stuff. So that will be important. Yeah, but anyway, go for it, Matt. Yeah.
Just to add, it's something that we've looked at with our primaries actually, and we've kind of, as a universal thing, we've got rid of this absolute nonsense of you can't have a pen license until you can write, you know, coercively, or you know, it's just absolute nonsense. We're working a lot more on now. What is the quickest way? Because obviously they need to. I like going back to exams. They need to write for speed. So it's what is the quickest way that you can write legibly and in a way that works for you, and for some of them, you know, if they can develop that non-cursive, you know, writing, and it's quicker, you know, fab. I think correct me if I'm wrong, and the problem that we find, and the last time that I looked into this, was that when it comes to the point where they're no longer, the writing isn't legible, particularly like a Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4, all the research, as far as I'm aware, shows that actually nothing works in correcting that, and there isn't anything definitive that is an intervention as such. So all these expensive interventions that schools buy, packages to improve handwriting and all that stuff. As far as I'm aware, there might be new stuff that's come out, and you might be telling me different in a minute, but I think that's a challenge, because it doesn't seem like anything really works.
Yeah, man, I can't tell you any different, because I'm not aware of any like stuff about handwriting interventions to improve handwriting, if you know what I mean. I could go and look up, see what it said. I can't remember having read any on the EF website or anything like that. So that's very interesting. So what you're saying is it kind of gets, once it perhaps goes on a slide from Key Stage 1, 2, and then it gets bad, it can't then be improved after that. Is that the message?
But it seems from what I mean, like I said, maybe I've not looked into it for a bit, but it just seems that way, that all the I know the EF, for example, have taken off now a lot of the kind of trials and tests that they've done where things haven't worked as well. Excuse me. And they've just kept things on. I'm sorry, I'm just having a coughing fit now. They've just kept things on, obviously, that do work, so people can direct to the things that do work, which I guess is probably why there's nothing on there a minute about handwriting. But there may be other programs out there that now do work. I don't know. But it's always a challenge, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Right. Anyway, let's crack on, because I've just noticed the time is 4:25. Right, so here's some we're got a couple of examples now. I think there's one from Art coming up in a minute and stuff. But this is obviously an English example, looking at higher quality analytical paragraphs. This is from a Year 9 class, apparently, looking at Much Ado About Nothing. So what they were trying to do here, it says the ability to focus in on key words, but most tellingly was the use of non-finite verbs to extend the analysis. And then the teacher used that to be able to teach the discrete skill there of using those showing words, making words to kind of link it. So this is that one. So when teaching a discrete skill, it's important to allow students to repeat the skill each time, perhaps with some of the scaffolding removed. So we kind of know that. Here's one from Art. So these are examples of the Key Stage 3 assessment objectives for Art. And it's obviously showing some of the, I know it's not very clear, but it shows some of the key vocabulary that the students are going to have to be able to demonstrate in order to meet that assessment objective, and therefore probably need to be explicitly taught. You know, what does a personal response mean in art? When it says refine our ideas, what does that actually mean in art? What are the processes? What are the techniques, material? You know, you can see some of the words there. So even in art, this sort of explicit language going to need to be taught, practiced, modeled, scaffolded, and then that removed. Here's a good science one. So this is what we were talking about earlier. In the notes here, it says this science GCSE would get full marks for the question, even though it's bullet pointed. So these days you can actually just bullet point 6 mark. This wouldn't be a 6 marker, it'd probably be just 4 marks, but even 6 marker, you could literally just bullet point it, but it's not particularly really well written. It's not a good piece of writing if you did bullet mark it. So actually we can, it doesn't take, I don't think, too much practice to start to get some of these linking words together. So we're moving from, in the past, Moose would have shown variation in antler length, and then we're adding words like therefore, this caused, this leads to, because of that, this happens, whatever we want to do. But that makes it, go for it. Yeah.
Would you get some more points if you put those words in?
It totally used to be like that, but not anymore. So I can't remember what year it changed.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely used to. So, yeah, it was like 4 or 5 years ago. I could look at how, I can't remember just when it changed. But yeah, literally, no, it doesn't matter anymore. We do a lot of past papers, obviously, with kids when we were, preparing for revising and stuff. And so very often older papers will say, in this question, you will get extra marks for high quality written communication. And we always say to kids, well, it doesn't matter anymore. So it's just about the science content. But, obviously I teach them things like this. But again, it comes down to curriculum time, in a year 11 lesson early on, I probably would go through, let's use some of this kind of linking language and structure some sentences together. When we're revising, no, now we're trying to be concise. We're moving on, it probably would be just thinking about the science content. But certainly, years 9, 10, early 11, you would hopefully get this. But again, this comes back to the different components. This is, you got to plan your answer first. So you might want to plan it by bullet pointing and then practice the kind of joining all that together in a kind of cohesive sentence, a bit more structured, if you see what I mean. So what they're saying here is just providing a document like this to pupils is probably not going to be helpful. But being selective about which connectives to use, which kind of things to use within the context of a particular question or within the context of a particular episode or sequence of lessons, then it becomes much more useful for kids. It's like the old stuff, I think we probably said this when we were doing vocabulary, that word walls by themselves are pretty pointless. Actually, though, if you bringing those in and using them within the context of your learning, then they become much more useful. So something like this could be really useful, but this might be a scaffold to put on a desk or have on a wall or a slide on your TV when it's being used, and then gradually withdrawn and so on and so forth. So again, like I said before, the evidence around all this is very much contextual, very much, discrete skills, but in the context of your subject and so on. So again, this is just asking us to have a little think about what is making a successful writer in our particular subject. So, obviously we've got a few different subjects represented here: maths, English, science, and they're all going to be different. So it's definitely worth spending, I think, faculty time making sure that faculties have the opportunity to discuss building blocks of text that we talked about this for reading, but building blocks of text that they're going to have to be writing and things that go towards that. Subject knowledge, topic knowledge is going to be massive in a subject like science. Vocabulary is going to be huge. Structure probably matters slightly less. It's important in terms of the logical sequence in a 4-mark answer, like we saw with that, like explaining how moose got their antlers or whatever. But actually, it's less important than perhaps a history essay, for example. Yeah, so that's just encouraging you to think, or get your colleagues at school to think in a disciplinary way. So let's just have a little pause here then. We can have a little chat. So I know I'm rambling quite a bit. Consider a text on your subject. What are the discrete skills that you would need to teach them? When we model, we might be thinking. So, what are the sort of building blocks of text that are very common in your subject? Or perhaps you could be a bit more specific and think about something you've encountered this week, just to share. What were the building blocks of that text that you were getting the kids to write? Paula, why don't we? I'm picking on people, I'm afraid. Sorry, Paula. Can you think of anything immediately that you might be able to share with us?
Yeah, I think the structure one
Yeah.
is quite interesting for us at the moment. I'm just thinking, so English year 11, that we feel that we teach the same structure of how to answer certain questions and write certain essays quite consistently, but building it up over the years. However, we have year 11s who suddenly now just freaking out that they're not able to just transfer that pretty much same structure to different like parts of their literature text or different questions or what have you. So we're just finding that the repetition of the same thing over and over and over again is needed. So it's I don't know if it's the year group a little bit as well, but their lack of independence in doing that. But while we're doing that, and we follow the I do, we do, you do, so we are modelling and all of that, we're almost taking away some of their independence because they're relying on the structure too much. So it's something that, like, you don't want to be there in year 11, but for some reason in this year group, it's just it's just come out. I don't know if it's the pressure, exam pressure, or anything like that. But generally across school, these the building blocks of the background knowledge and vocabulary is one we're working on this year. Structure seems to be pretty good, but like I said, whether we do enough after that first draft of editing, and whether we do enough moving forward to take away that structure to really develop those much more personal responses. And I suppose that's time again as well, rather than just getting an answer out of them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think with all scaffolding, the gradual removal of that and the timing of when you do that is sometimes quite hard to judge, isn't it? For whatever activity and skill you're doing, but really important, obviously, to remove it and give them plenty of time to get that independence. So that's where we want them. Pip, what about you? Any particular texts?
We've the making sure that we're trying to get everybody currently with year 11 to identify the format, audience and purpose across sort of different subject areas can be really beneficial for English language paper 2, particularly when they have to come to write their own non-fiction stuff. So sort of being able to spot the structural features that they can see in a science text or a history text, whatever, so that when they come to do that in English, then it comes more naturally. Trying to sort of get colleagues to use that same FAP acronym to just try and sort of show them that it's the same skills but just in different areas.
So just to clarify, you mean you get scientists, maths teachers, history teachers to use that language?
It's not embedded, but it's something that I'm working on because I think that it could be very, very helpful for students to see that it's the same. It's reading is the same in every subject, but it's more, as a general base. But then how to read like a scientist is like this non-fiction piece of writing. And then when you say non-fiction in another classroom, they think, oh yeah, I've done that. They can start metacognitively, hopefully making those links.
Oh, brilliant! Thank you. Anybody else? Hannah, what about you?
Yeah, I was just thinking actually about non-fiction writing and specifically about speech writing that we work on a lot with students for the paper 2 question 5 focus for English language. And I thought that was really interesting what you were saying, Pip, about because I think PAF had a bit of a moment a while ago in teaching, and then it kind of kind of like went out of vogue a bit, and now it's really interesting to hear that how you're using it in different subjects, and that's something I might talk about with colleagues where I am. But yeah, interesting. And I think especially with speech writing as well, that kind of whole trying to show them that a piece of writing needs signposting all the way through it, and trying to teach them explicitly those signposts that they can use to almost guide a listener through. And it feeds in then to the spoken language work that we do with students as well, and that assessment. But yeah, it was really interesting, Pip, to hear what you were saying there about purpose, audience and format and things.
Yeah, really useful tool, I think. That. Thank you, Pip. And thank you, Hannah. It's very useful. Matt or Sam, anything to add? You don't have to.
I think, to be fair, everything's what I could say has been said, really, particularly as an English from an English perspective. Yeah, completely agree with what's been said in terms of how we get there, and the building. That sounds interesting. Of what's been the things that have been suggested so far of that people are trying and doing.
Yeah, thank you. Go, Sam.
I was going to say in maths is that there are certain areas. One of the things we're doing with our English is doing this. We're doing a big write project at the moment, the English department, where they're trying to do a piece of exam writing for homework every week, bring it in, assess it in class, not assess it as such, but work on it in class with the expert there to help you. Trying to build up their confidence with being able to do this for their exams. That's year 11. Obviously, there's more detail than that, which I'm not good at. Thank you for explaining purpose, audience, format, because I was trying to work out what PAF meant. I was like the dad with the jar of peanut butter for a minute there. But in maths, there are specific ways that we teach certain language. So, for instance, with my year 11s at the moment, I've been trying to teach them to respond to a compare these two data sets question, where they very specifically have to state, on average, so such and such has a better, higher, something comparative word, and then some context, score, time, because they have a higher median, that kind of thing. So it's quite hard to get them to be interpretive. They want to be descriptive. They just want to say, they either want to give an opinion about whether they think somebody would or wouldn't have that and not use the data, or they want to just be descriptive and say that this box plot looks like that box plot looks like that, without interpreting. So that's the kind of one of the skill sets that we need them to build in terms of being able to write those texts.
Yeah, and I think for us, when you get colleagues talking about the sort of questions that come up and therefore the responses need, it can be really, really useful. Just coming off what you said, Sam, we were talking the other day about, command words, because we have things like, evaluate, compare, in a science exam, compare fuels. I was looking at one and you have a little table and all that sort of stuff. And then we use the mark schemes a lot to then model to the kids, like, show through and be explicit about what they said. But even things like, when you see the word describe in science, in a science question, what they want is almost like a statement of fact. You just state a bit of knowledge. Whereas when you see the word explain, you really need to, in your writing, use the word because. This is happening because, because it's they want a reason. So it's, breaking down questions like that. But I know we talk quite a lot, all of us, about year 11, rightly so, very important. I also think we don't do this enough here yet, because we've been doing a lot of stuff on reading last couple of years. But I'm also thinking, if we start some of this stuff all the way back in year 7, year 8, and plan it, really nicely in the curriculum, how much of a benefit, or maybe how much more time we can develop to writing, obviously reading as well, but writing, because we're talking about it today, writing and the skills there, in order to prepare them even better, get them in a better place by the time they get to year 11. I don't know about your school, but I feel like we're always firefighting here, rather, like putting on extra. We're doing lesson 5 now, after school, and doing all these revision clubs, and we're like, well, what have we been doing for the last 4 years?
Yeah, there is that. I mean, this particular group for us is late because the COVID gap, the whole concept of data is a little bit low. But I don't use mark schemes per se. Well, I do use mark schemes. I'm an examiner for Edexcel. So we do AQA, but I examine for Edexcel. So I use my experience of what marking hundreds and hundreds of questions to try and give the kids the best response types.
Yeah, absolutely. It is about us as experts in the subject helping the kids to communicate with their writing exactly, in this case, what they need to get the marks in an exam, which is sometimes very specific, particularly in science, and I'm sure in maths as well. No, I'm sure in all subjects. All right, let's just move on to this really quickly. So at the end of recommendation 4, it talks about motivation as a thing to consider, which often is really hard. Particularly, we talked about it in terms of writing. Motivation seems to be reading. We talked about that before. Motivation seems to be fairly low in terms of numbers, and there's recent reports that don't paint a pretty picture at the moment of reading. But actually, motivation, the evidence suggests, can be really crucial in terms of helping students become successful in writing. So some of the strategies that seem promising are having episodes of writing practice where students collaborate. So they're writing together in pairs or small teams, and thinking and with your modeling and explicit teaching about that specific structured feedback, some of which we've been talking about, for feedback at each stage of the writing process. Competition seems, again, promising. So challenging students to beat their score in self or peer assessed piece of writing, that might be an approach people take. And self-talk, which is obviously part of self-regulation and metacognition, but encouraging students to celebrate successes in writing as a key part of their approach. So they're mentioned in the guidance report, so quite useful. Just wanted to mention this. I'm pretty sure this is on the Padlet. But really, really useful. We use these all the time, actually, to sort of judge where we are. But these RAG tools, so they're, as you can see, they're written. There's a RAG bunch of descriptions for each of the recommendations. They've combined 4 and 5 here. But obviously, so you can use it to judge where your school are. But obviously, you can also use it to read the green one and kind of see, that's where we want to be heading. That's what a really good exemplary implementation of this might look like. Actually, it might be of interest, and I might have said this to you before, but I've turned this into a whole school staff survey, actually, just using some of the statements there in terms of getting teachers to rate on a score out of 5 or something, some individual statements. So me and the person who leads literacy across the school did that for our school. We did it together first, and we had got certain answers, certain responses. But then I thought it would be interesting to see if everybody else thought that. And we got some even more interesting responses in terms of where people thought we were at for all of the literacy recommendations. But that's a really useful thing. One thing we haven't mentioned tonight, I'm just looking at the second little box down there on the right, is about TAs. Because TAs, again, we mentioned them when we talked about reading a bit, but TAs, of course, are a massive resource in lots of schools that, if deployed correctly and supported correctly, can be a huge impact for our students, particularly disadvantaged students. So definitely worth thinking about. So fairly quickly, because we're coming to the end, but looking a little bit at recommendation number 5, I'll just give you a couple of seconds to read those. These are the kind of subheadings underneath the recommendation, which is combine writing instruction with reading in every subject. So the idea, I think, really behind this, from the evidence, is that reading and writing are very much complementary. I'm going to scooch through this. We've kind of done that. So have a look through the guidance report. We'll talk about it now. But because they're complementary, actually, there's various things that you could do, various approaches. So without us reading it, I'll tell you very briefly about also some of the ways that you might effectively combine reading and writing are on the screen there. So writing before reading is perhaps getting students to bullet point what they currently know about a particular topic, or generate questions that they might be asking later after they've read something. So they're doing a bit of writing before they read a particular text. That might be one way. Using annotations. A lot of schools talk about annotating exam questions, for example. I'm sure annotation is massive in English across, poems and texts like that. So it can be really good. But annotation, not just highlighting the course, notes and things like that. Identifying, we talked about this, haven't we? Identifying key features of the text, the format, the audience, the things that they should be looking for. Writing short summaries could be a good way of combining writing and reading. Short summaries are a skill in itself. That I guess could go along with note making as well. So some teachers here, we haven't made this consistent across all subjects, but some teachers are really good at teaching their skills about the Cornell note-taking method. So a skill, again, to be practiced, but could be. Creating checklists is based on examples of good writing in each subject. So for example, when reading a geography textbook, the teacher might ask the students to highlight words related to cause and effect, such as due to this, or a contributory factor was. And then students can subsequently use their checklists and examples in their own answer. So it's creating checklists out of high quality text. And then anticipating misconceptions or errors, highlighting how writers avoid them in your subject. That could be another way. So a bit of SPAG. So SPAG, it turns out that actually it says, I'll read you from the guidance report, spelling should be actively taught rather than simply tested. So a key component, as it says here, of writing is fluency. So there's limited high quality evidence about how best to teach spelling. One thing we do know is that spelling tests aren't particularly effective, but actively teaching spelling is at least promising. So actively teaching spelling. And the other bit of evidence you need to know about is the fact that decontextualized spelling, again, is fairly low impact, but contextualized explicit teaching of correct spelling is much more effective. So, for example, teaching the key words of a particular topic and breaking them down, we'll look at this in a second, but looking at their etymology and this, that, and the other. So here are some of the strategies that you can use for thinking about spelling, punctuation, grammar, that sort of stuff. So teaching related spellings alongside discussion of morphology, etymology. We looked at that when we looked at vocabulary, breaking words down into their morphemes and looking at the etymology, perhaps of the roots and prefixes, suffixes, and so on. Pre-teaching spellings of challenging words, anticipating common errors. Again, not decontextualized. Context is really important. So that might be for example, at the start of a topic when you're going to do photosynthesis, so you need to know photosynthesis, chlorophyll, chloroplast, so on and so forth. So complex words that are similar and confused with other cells. I get a lot of kids. The stuff inside a cell is called cytoplasm, and chloroplast and cytoplasm often get confused, particularly in year 7. Kids write chloroplasm and cytoplast, for example. So breaking down the words into their component morphemes and looking at what those words mean actually helps understand not only the vocabulary, which is important, but actually also how to spell them. Helping students recognize familiar patterns of letters within words. Obviously much more common in phonics works, particularly at primary school and early years, but actually really could be quite helpful. Collaborative approaches, for example, grouping students, asking pairs to come up with memorable strategies for spelling challenging words. It's all, I used to do Latin when I was at school, and we had this teacher who terrified the life out of us. But some of the words that come from Latin, I know from his lessons, because I think I was so horrified and so scared all the time, exactly how to spell them. I never misspelled them wrong. So I couldn't tell you what exactly he said about them, but I know, for example, necessary is spelt with 1 C and 2 S's. And I know that because from his lecture. Do you know what I mean? So there are some ways you remember words. Parallel's a good one. I hope I'm spelling this right, but it's got 2 L's, hasn't it? Parallel in the middle, I mean. Which, because obviously they're lines that look like parallel, for example, things like that. And then teaching students to self-quiz using retrieval practice, using flashcards, so on and so forth like that. So, well, there you go. I'll just show you some slides there. These are just examples. So we've seen that one before, photo, sin, and thesis. Looking at the etymology, nostalgia, for example, in this case. So here's the idea about context is everything. Context is much more severe. It just means that, you know, if we're going to teach, I'm thinking about command words, but, you know, command words really important for them to know. Actually, not really probably useful for them to spell, but anyway. So Christmas Carol, you might include some of these words, but if you were going to do avaricious or avarice outside of looking at Christmas Carol, it might not be therefore useful, so it won't come up again. Mark Rowland often talks about this, that we have to have multiple meaningful interactions with words, and that obviously is going to happen much more if it's coming up in the context of the topic you're talking about. Pre-teaching spelling, challenging words, anticipating examples. So we probably all know words in our subject that are misspelt quite often, so we can anticipate that. We can be very clear to the students to explicitly teach it. Right, we're going to teach a topic on government, and therefore, you know, teach them the fact that govern meant, and you can break it down and so on and so forth. So perhaps worth thinking about some of the common misspelled words, and you can get lists of very commonly misspelled words very easily on the internet. So here's some of the research. Multiple reviews indicate that teaching grammar as standalone does not have a positive impact. I've said that. Is that context is really important. Instead, it appears more promising to teach grammar in ways that highlights how grammatical changes, this is disciplinary text, can convey different types of meaning in the context of given types of writing, rather than on defining and describing grammatical terms in the abstract. In other words, if I want to teach kids about the best use of colons and things like that and semicolons, it's best to teach that in the context of something where we've got text that either they read that in, or that I'm asking them to write and include those that they're going to use it again and again. I'll just pause for a second and let you read that. So again, quite important, slight change of words at the bottom there. If Hitler had been killed at the Beer Hall Putsch, the war would have been prevented. And then some slightly different ones. All right, really quickly, slightly ran out of time, so I've rambled on too long. Okay, just have a very quick read of that. I promise we won't be too long. Any slides we scooch through just at the end here will be available on the thing. So this is just a quick exercise in having a little think about how this school A, is matching up against, hopefully you've had a quick read, matching up against the rag sheet. So we're thinking, are they exemplary in some areas, intermediate, ineffective? So what do we think are some good practices for school A? What do we think are some perhaps weaker practices for school A? This is a fictional case study, by the way. What perhaps are some of the next steps that they might look to undertake? Hannah, what do you reckon? Kick us off, Hannah.
Well, I think obviously some of the stuff that's embedded in history is obviously very, very good, isn't it? They seem to be able to make that connection between their thought process in their mind and what's going down on paper really, really well. There seems to be a lot of practice of that. That's perhaps not consistent across the school, judging by what's going on in other subjects. So maybe there could be some work like going on between the history department and other departments there, I would suggest, maybe.
Yeah. Awesome. Right, just because it's 5-2, 4-2 now, crumbs. This was good, John. Thank you, Hannah. It's so good. This is what the slides say. So you're absolutely right. In other subjects, they need to perhaps have a think about our history well. English RS, geography, students are demonstrating great knowledge, but they're struggling to pick up the higher marks. So not much writing in the book. So perhaps they need to take a lesson out of history's book, as it were, metaphorical book. Start doing some of that modelling. Right, we're going to scooch through school B. We can scooch through this. All right. So I think there's another active. This is a good example of sentence combining activity. So there's a few little different strategies at the end here. This is a really good one. I like this example. Tudor clothing was uncomfortable, and separate sentence. The Tudors dressed up for extravagant parties. So asking students to kind of combine those sentences to get a much better written thing. So you can see there, despite the fact that Tudor clothing wasn't comfortable, the Tudors dressed up for extravagant parties. So that might be a nice little activity to have a go at, using words like because, but, so on and so forth, giving some sentence starters. I know I'm scooching through these really quickly. There we go. Right. So these slides are available on the Padlet, along with this recording, which I'll stop now. There we go.